We're rolling.
Okay. Set?
Yeah.
We're good. All right. Great. Thank you.
Thanks for being here with everybody. My name's Annabel Wong. I am a joint master's degree student in public policy and education.
I'm Benji Nguyen. I'm a second year Master of Public Policy.
Hi, I'm Sylesh. I'm doing my major in economics and my MA in public policy.
Our client for our project was Volcker Alliance, and we're thrilled to have Bill Glasswell with us here today. He's the director of state and local program at Volcker Alliance. And of course, we extend our gratitude to the public policy program and everybody who could be here today. The title of our presentation is Policy Responses to Increased Bank Loans to Municipal Government. Scintillating. We'll be talking about California's municipal market, and specifically, we will examine a particular means through which the municipalities in which we live fund the things that we want to see in them, specifically bank loans. So why do bank loans matter? I want to tell you about Lawrence, Wisconsin. Lawrence is a small town of 4,600 people, just south of Green Bay, Wisconsin. In September 2015, a credit ratings agency, S&P, conducted a routine review of Lawrence's credit rating in order to update their credit rating. A town's credit rating is important because it's a signal of their financial stability and reliability. In this routine review, S&P downgraded Lawrence's credit rating from AA, which is the third highest rating, to BB+, which is basically junk status. And this is really bad for the town of Lawrence because it could result in their inability to attract new investors, since that's a signal of potentially a more risky place to invest, as well as forcing the town potentially to accept higher interest rates for the investors that do choose to invest, which of course is money that could have been spent otherwise for the town's residents. So how did this happen? Lawrence borrowed $4.6 million from local banks. That's about 3 times its annual revenue. And unfortunately, the town also agreed to a provision in these loan agreements that protected banks but exposed the town to increased risk. The banks, as soon as they decide that the town of Lawrence has financially deteriorated, which is something that they can define, they can demand immediate repayment. This is a highly unusual clause, and in light of this, S&P decided that the town was under greater risk, and so downgraded the credit rating. So our project is on the phenomenon of bank loans as a means of municipal finance. We are interested in getting a greater sense of what these municipal direct loans are, as well as private placements, which is an instrument that I'll be describing a little bit more later on. We selected this topic for our year-long practicum, and though credit rating agencies and legal firms, regulators have produced writings on this topic, there's been relatively little academic literature produced about it. And we conducted this research in partnership with the Volcker Alliance, whose mission is to address challenges to effective execution of public policies and rebuild public trust in government. All right, here's an outline. We'll start with an overview of municipal finance and then move on to the particulars of our project, the research questions, the ways in which the means through which we've answered them, some of our findings, what they mean, and a discussion of policy recommendations. So let's begin with municipal finance basics, a primer. Municipality, for those of us in the room who might need it, a municipality such as a city or a county or a school district provides services like parks, libraries, and schools. And they do this through revenue streams such as property taxes, sales taxes, and utilities fees. In circumstances where they need more revenue or more funds, such as in cases, such as for, as in parallel as individuals when we have to buy a home or pay for grad school. They also have means to borrow more money. And so their options include public bonds, private placements, and direct loans. So one means of borrowing money are public bonds. For example, the city of Menlo Park in 2012 issued $38 million in public bonds to renovate and expand their park and recreation facilities. So Menlo Park selected an underwriter or bank to buy the bonds that they had issued and subsequently sell that to a market of investors. The municipality in that way gains capital in order to undertake their projects, and investors collect interest on a regular schedule until the bond matures or the loan agreement date is complete, and then they also get their the original amount that they invested back. The other options are bank loans, and we'll be discussing two types of bank loans: private placements and direct loans. Private placements are basically bonds that are purchased or privately placed, and that means that they are sold to one bank or a small group of banks who collect the interest directly rather than selling the bonds to other investors. And direct loans are situations in which the municipality enters into a loan agreement with a bank or a financial entity, much like we would do to pay for grad school. All right, so now we know the situations under which they might borrow money. So how would a municipality decide between a bank loan or a public bond? Well, as I've already mentioned, bank loans are transactions with relatively fewer investors, whereas public bonds are sold in a market of investors, and already that makes it a little simpler. Public loans often have agreements that have room for much more flexibility to be shaped to meet the needs of the particular project that they're going to fund. Whereas with public bonds, there's extensive standardized documentation required in order to issue bonds. In fact, some of this documentation is related to disclosure or transparency of these bonds. The disclosure of public bonds is heavily regulated by the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, the MSRB. All information about the issuances of bonds is made public through the MSRB, and public bonds need to be, all of them are reported to the MSRB in a very specific way. Bank loans are not governed by these disclosure regulations, and in fact, California was the first state to regulate this disclosure of bank loans, which was recently instituted in 2014. Bank loans are also perceived to be cheaper because they have lower costs and fewer fees. They don't have the same costs associated with public bonds, which include costs like paying the underwriter or bond attorneys. And then, and public bonds generally actually have lower interest rates, but we have seen that bank loans have been described as having competitive interest rates. So public bonds seem to be perceived as more costly and more time-consuming, but bank loans are generally, they tend to be chiefly available for smaller borrowing amounts. So there's really no one answer for whether a public bond or a bank loan is better for a municipality. It really depends on the financial situation and the project that they're pursuing. And of course, as you might expect, there are also risks affiliated with some of the factors that do make bank loans more attractive. So for example, the more flexibility that can result in risky clauses like the one that Lawrence, Wisconsin found themselves in, and other clauses that might jeopardize existing bondholders' positions, like acceleration clauses, which Sylesh will discuss a little later. Fewer disclosure regulations can mean lack of transparency around the issuance of these bank loans, as well as potential misinformation in financial statements. So disclosure data is really important because it informs the market. This means that it could allow regulators to spot market failures that can be corrected with more regulation, or even just to reduce the information asymmetry between investors and the municipal issuers. Whew, okay, that's a lot of So we examine California data to characterize bank loans, identify areas of potential concern, and then discuss some areas where public policy might be helpful. So we were guided by these three questions. What are the characteristics of private placements and direct loans in California? We don't really know enough. The discussion so far that I've had has been pretty theoretical. So are there numbers associated, and what can we learn from this data? What are the effects of private placements and direct loan provisions on municipal borrowing and investors? Are there systemic concerns that we should be paying attention to? Is there a role for public policy to improve the market for municipalities? If there are concerns, what should we be doing on the policy side? So I'll hand it over to Benji.
Right, so to answer these research questions, we used 3 primary data sources. Firstly, we conducted about 15 interviews with a variety of municipal borrowers, financial institutions, bond councils, etc., as recommended by our client and various interviewees. We also analyzed data collected by the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission, or CDAC. CDAC is basically a part of the California State Treasurer's Office that compiles data for all debt issuances issued in the state of California throughout many, many years. For our purposes, we use this data primarily to get a better understanding of what private placements look like in California. And in particular, we looked at data from the years 2012 to 2016, because 2012 was when CDAC was first distinguishing between private placements and public bonds. And lastly, we also looked at 27 direct loan documents that CDAC again provided from the year 2016 to get a better understanding of the structure of these direct loans and what kind of clauses they contain and how they may affect municipalities. So as Annabel mentioned, one of our primary research questions was, what are the characteristics of private placements and direct loans in California? Obviously, this is a very broad question, and so we broke this question into a series of sub-questions that we could systematically answer using CDAC's high-level data. Here are some of the questions, and the first one I'll kind of go through are how private placements changed over time. Namely, can we say they're increasing? Can we say there are more than being issued? Can we say that there is more money being issued per private placement? So the first thing we kind of looked at was the actual number of private placements being issued over time. So this graph shows the number of private placements versus the number of public offerings being issued each year from 2012 to 2016. The gray kind of burnt orange bar at the top represents the number of public offerings being issued that year. This, for example, there are 1,247 of them issued in 2012. And the other line represents the number of private placements issued in that year. Again, this is just count and just number. As you can see, the number of public offerings has remained kind of constant over the last 5 years, but the number of private placements has been kind of steadily increasing, and by 2015 there were actually more private placements being issued than public offerings. So kind of basic finding number 1, there's a higher number of private placements now. They are increasing. But what does it say about the amount of money actually being issued? So the next thing we looked at was how much money was being issued across both financial instruments over these last 5 years. So again, the gray bar represents public offerings and blue bar represents private placements. This shows in billions of dollars how much money was issued via that financing instrument in a given year. So in 2012, $60 billion were issued via public offerings. So from this graph, you can see that it's actually remained kind of constant over time, and there is a lot more money being issued via public offerings. This kind of makes sense because public offerings are generally issued for much higher amounts of money, and private placements are issued via a small amount of money. So while it does look like that the trend that we saw previously, the jump in count of our private placements would suggest a jump in perhaps the amount of money being issued, we see this isn't necessarily the case. That said, I'd like to point out that in 2016, though, there was a huge jump in the amount of money being issued in private placements between the 2 years. So in 2015, we're looking at $7 billion being issued, but in 2016, there was a huge jump. This is the start of a greater trend. It's unclear at this moment because we can't look into the future, unfortunately, but something to look out for. So yeah, the amount of debt issued via private placements has remained kind of constant, but there's been a recent jump. So there are more of them being issued. It's kind of hard to say if they're really increasing, but we suspect that this might be the case, given that jump we just saw. The next sub-question I'd like to answer is how do private placements differ from public offerings? Specifically, I'm looking at how they will be differing in terms of average interest rate between the two financial instruments and average total issuance cost. So I should explain issuance cost first. So issuance cost is basically the amount of money it costs for a municipality to issue a given bond or loan. The things that go into this cost include things like underwriter fee, fees for your bond attorney, fees for credit rating agencies, etc. So this graph tracks the trend in average issuance costs for public offerings versus private placements over the last 5 years. The top line shows public offerings, the bottom line shows private placements. So as you can see, based off these numbers, public offerings on average have a much higher issuance cost, usually triple that the amount of private placements. Again, we're looking at a factor of about 3. This kind of makes sense given what Annabel said. We expect public offerings to be issued, to be much more expensive to issue. So yeah, it costs about 3 times as much to issue public offerings as it does to issue private placements. Next, we look at interest rates. This time, private placements are on top, they're the top line, and the bottom line represents public offerings. Generally, private placements have about double the interest rate of public offerings. We're looking at range of about 6% versus like 3% for public offerings. Again, this is consistent with what we learned from our interviews and what Annabel talked about. Private placements are generally more attractive because you can issue them for much less money, but on the other hand, they have higher interest rates that come with them. Talking to a lot of municipalities, they oftentimes tell us that in general they would prefer to issue public offerings, but oftentimes the costs for public offerings are so prohibitive and there's so much resources that go into issuing them that they kind of fall back on private placements sometimes. And this is reflected in the data. And kind of the third sub-question we want to answer is what are private placements being used for? Specifically, what kind of projects are they being used to fund in California? So this table basically breaks down all the private placements in California by purpose of funding, i.e. like what kind of project they were being used for, and ranks them based on how much money from private placements was going into each of those purposes. So on the left-hand side, you have the name of the purpose of funding, so something like it can be used for funding for multifamily housing, or public transit, etc. And on the right side, that's the total amount of money that went into funding that purpose from private placements in the year 2016. I'm not going to walk through all these, you can read these for yourself, but there's a wide variety of things that private placements are being used for, and these are the top 9 or so. There are interesting trends associated with each of these, but for this presentation, I'm only going to look into the top 2, multifamily housing and residential energy. I should note here that multifamily housing gets the most amount of money by far, and it's about like triple the amount of the second highest, like 3.9 versus 1.3 billion. So a closer look into how multifamily housing funding has changed over time. This shows the total amount of money from private placements that went into multifamily housing in a given year from private placements through the last 5 years. It's kind of hard to swallow, sorry. But so in 2012, we're looking at about $1.3 billion total coming from private placements into multifamily housing, and by 2016, that amount has tripled. So obviously, private placements are becoming increasingly important as a financing instrument for housing projects. Based on our interviews, we suspect that this is because building more affordable housing is becoming increasingly important for city governments around the state, and it'll be interesting to see how this trend continues in the future. Right now, it's kind of hard to say whether or not that this shift towards private placements is going to be disastrous for housing departments across the state or something, but it's something to keep in mind. And this shows the average amount of money issued per private placement for multifamily housing versus the average amount of money issued for all private placements. So basically, the top line shows the average amount of money for a given year that went into multifamily housing from private placements, and the bottom line shows the average amount of money that went into a private placement for all projects in a given year. And as you can see, the average amount of money that goes into multifamily housing is a lot higher, and while across all private placements it's actually been decreasing between these 4 years, multifamily housing has been kind of like increasing. So basically, these multifamily housing private placements incur a lot more money than the average one. So again, this is something to watch out for in the future. The second sector of development, we want to look at was energy, which is an interesting case. Partly because back in 2012, the number of private placements being issued for energy was only at like around less than 300, 288, and by 2016, it increased by almost 5-fold, looking at like 1,231. Now, if you remember from our previous graph, the number of private placements has been increasing steadily over the last 5 years, and this is largely in part because the main financing instrument for residential energy has shifted from public offerings to private placements, And if you look at the whole database, actually over 60% of private placements in the CDAC database are used for residential energy conservation. We wanted to figure out why this is the case and where all these placements were coming from. So we found out that all these energy private placements are being issued by kind of one entity known as the Western Riverside Council of Governments, or WRCOG. Basically, there's one power authority that represents 17 cities in Riverside County, and back in 2013, they partnered with a bond issuer to start a massive statewide green energy conservation program to make houses conserve more energy. And because they fund primarily through private placements, they kind of took over kind of most of the products in the state for residential energy conservation, and as a result, all that funding that goes into that sector has kind of shifted towards private placements. So it'll be interesting to see if there's more of this kind of phenomenon around other parts of the nation. And yeah, at this point, that's kind of some basic high-level data findings we found that characterize private placements in California using the CDAC database. And I'll pass it over to Sylesh.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the analysis we did regarding direct loan agreements. We found that there was 27 direct loan agreements in the CDAC database for 2016, and so that's what we looked at. Each loan agreement actually had a very similar structure to each other, and the structure is basically this. If a municipality meets an event of default or breaks a financial covenant, the lender is entitled to a remedy on default. The situation is a little bit more nuanced than that, but I'll get into it. Okay, so events of default. We found a lot of standard events of default. For example, if the municipality fails to make payments to the lender and the lender reminds them and they continue to do so, then that constitutes as a default. If they declare themselves to be bankrupt or insolvent, that's pretty reasonable as well. That's a default. As well as if they make a misleading or inaccurate statement regarding their financial situation on the loan agreement, that's a default as well. However, we did find some events of default that were relatively rare, uncommon, that we didn't expect. First is cross default. Cross default means that if the municipality defaults on some loan or some debt that's not related to this loan, they actually automatically default on this one as well. And that probably is somewhat problematic, and we'll get into that. Ratings downgrade is also interesting too, because what that says is that if the municipality's rating was AA, S&P gave it a credit rating of AA when the agreement was written, and then a couple of years later it's BB, then that could also constitute an event of default as well. That's problematic because essentially you have a situation where the municipality is not really in control of its credit rating. It can only indirectly affect it. The credit rating agency could easily change the weights, what type of criteria they judge the credit rating on, and so that might be unfair to the municipality. We actually expected to see a lot of financial covenants that were not favorable to the municipality or were particularly troublesome, but that wasn't the case. We saw two particular ones somewhat frequently. Debt service coverage ratio. That's basically making sure that the municipality has enough operating revenues, available revenues coming in compared to the debt service coverage ratio that's like kind of going out, the cash flow going out. And the agreement said that it had to have a ratio of 1.25, which is in line with like a historical number from other literature, other types of loans. And the other requirement that we saw in financial covenants was a liquidity requirement. The municipality should have a certain amount of net liquid assets, and that's basically was like correlated to the par value of the debt. So if the loan agreement was for like $5 million, it'd be the liquidity requirement would be much higher than if it was for $1 million. Oh, and I should say that for this financial covenant, let's say the municipality breaks it, it's known as like a technical default, but the municipality, if it replenishes its cash reserves, then the lender is not really entitled to remedy anymore. And lastly, remedies on default. We saw that a lot of them were very similar. Cease to extend credit to the municipality. That makes some sense, right? If the municipality is in default, the lender is not going to lend any more money. The lender is permitted to proceed with court action to enforce performance of financial covenants or any other things. And the most important one we saw was accelerate the immediate repayment of the loan, or the acceleration clauses, basically saying that if the municipality defaults, then it has to repay back the loan, which probably they were going to repay it on a schedule of 10 years or 15 years, and now they have to repay it pretty close to immediately. And we thought that it was an issue because you can have a situation, worst case scenario, where a municipality defaults on one loan. There's a bunch of cross-default provisions in different types of debt, and there's a chain reaction where they have to pay back a whole bunch of debt that's accelerated all at once. That can create huge strains on the municipality. Okay, so what are the implications of the findings from what Benji and I talked about? What do the growth trends tell us? Bank loans are probably slowly growing. We're not exactly sure, but it looks like they're growing. But it's still, in any case, a small share of the entire types of financing. Public offerings have low interest rates, which kind of makes up for the fact that they have high issuance costs. That's why they're still attractive to a lot of municipalities. And the data that we looked at can tell us a lot about sector changes. So it can tell us if certain types of financing are becoming more popular, if certain types of purposes of debt are becoming more popular or less popular, and that's something that regulators can keep an eye on. So the data is very useful in that sense. What does the direct loan analysis tell us? It tells us that there's a lot of harmful provisions in these loan agreements, harmful to municipalities and ultimately to taxpayers. There's a potential rise in the cost of borrowing that can occur, with the credit downgrades we talked about. That being said, we're in a very low interest rate environment right now, so that might not make a lot of difference now, but it could in the future. And these direct loan agreements are a huge risk to municipal investors who want to invest in municipal bonds. If they can't tell what the real indebtedness of a municipality is, then they're going to feel uncomfortable entering the market. And that might not seem like such a big deal, but the fact is if they're uncomfortable and if the market unravels a little bit, then it's going to be tough for municipalities to build schools and build parks, and that's why we should care. Okay, so now I want to get into our recommendations. First, state-based recommendations. So we recommend a greater enforcement of California's 2014 law that requires bank loans to be reported to CDEC. So it turns out from what CDEC has told us that the reporting rates for direct purchases and public bonds are actually very high. However, the reporting for direct loans is inconsistent. It's more like we don't know what we don't know, but we're guessing it's pretty low based on we can only find 27 loan agreements. And the reporting is important. You need a full picture because it actually even helps municipalities. If a municipality can see what a specific type of financing looks like in that database, they can see what type of loan agreement it is. They can make sure that they're getting a good deal, and that might be important for them. The way we also recommend kind of increased reporting is market penalties. We don't think formal penalties like fines might not be a good idea, but a market penalty might be good in the sense that issuers could disclose like a one-page summary of their alternative financings on some sort of platform or database, and that can help issuers understand which municipalities might have better disclosure practices, which might be better to invest in essentially. And outreach and education of municipalities. So during our interviews, we were actually surprised. We encountered a lot of financial officers of municipalities who were either unaware or had an incomplete understanding of California's 2014 law, and we think that CDEC and the state can play a greater role in increasing awareness of reporting requirements. Okay, and federal policy recommendations. So we actually had, we were thinking about recommendations pretty early on, And it turns out both the MSRB, Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, and SEC have like proposed amendments, kind of directly addressing the issues that we're talking about, which is good, but they kind of stole our thunder. So the first thing I'll talk about is the CUSIP numbers for private placements. There's also, like, a CUSIP number is basically an identification number for public bonds or public municipal bonds right now. And it basically helps with the matching and transactions between investors and municipalities. The CUSIP numbers are administered by S&P through the CUSIP Bureau, and they have an online database with all the basically issuances. And we think it's a really great idea to do the same for private placements too. It'll help bring some transparency in that market. We also believe that, so the SEC introduced amendments that basically require underwriters to require issuers to notify the MSRB if, of any direct loans, direct purchases, as well as occurrences of accelerations and defaults. The first thing that we really recommend is that they clarify what a material event is. So a material event is essentially an important event that should be disclosed. However, the reason why the MSRB is reluctant is that to clarify the definition is because a $1 million loan to Los Angeles might not be much, but a $1 million loan to Lawrence, Wisconsin might be really important. And so that's the reason why they might not want to make that clear. On the other hand, we think there has to be some guidelines, or else a municipality can always say, that wasn't a materially important event. The other thing that we strongly recommend is expanding the definition of financial obligations, because, for example, one thing that's not included in these disclosure requirements are pension contracts. And at the end of the day, pensions might pose bigger problems for municipalities in the future, and if those are not required to be disclosed, pension contracts might have higher seniority in like a debt waterfall sort of situation, and they might have preference over municipalities' assets over unsecured bondholders, general obligation bondholders, and so we think that definition needs to be expanded. And so those are our recommendations, and we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Questions?
First, just a couple of technical questions. Is interest on bank loans tax deductible compared to municipal bonds? Aren't municipal? If I buy a municipal bond, it's tax deductible?
That's correct. We're actually not. We haven't really looked at the tax deductibility aspects of the bank loans, really.
But shouldn't that affect the differential interest rates? If one's tax deductible, so you have tax exempt borrowers versus taxable borrowers or lenders.